Great to welcome now a man who's written a really fascinating book about one of the most interesting and fascinating musicians of all time. It's called Homeward Bound, The Life of Paul Simon. We're joined today by Peter Ames Carlin. I believe he's out in Oregon today. And Peter, good to talk with you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, you're exactly right. Portland, Oregon is where I'm sitting at this very moment.
Is it raining? Everybody asks you that probably, right?
Not at the moment, but it's fixing to do that a little later. It's that time of year.
Well, I grew up in New York, and I knew a little bit about Paul Simon because he was a Queens guy, but I guess like most people, we really didn't know a lot about his personal life or his background, and I guess that's what kind of makes people interested in his life. We all know the music, but the backstory is kind of fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's fascinating to read and understand how much the immigrant experience, growing up with in a family that had come fairly recently from Eastern Europe was, and the story of their family over the generations is the same, just a version of the story so many millions of Americans have lived of moving from the old world orthodoxy into the new world assimilation and the whole sort of flexibility of identity that goes along with it. I feel like, when you listen to Paul's work over the years and how he's moved from style to style and culture to culture and then eventually from nation to nation to nation, it's kind of that same process, putting a unique part of himself into the language and rhythms of a completely different culture and finding the kind of harmony between them. And, and that's what I hear a lot in the music, and I think he doesn't always address it in, specifically in his lyrics, but I just think the sounds that he pulls together speak volumes about it.
He rarely did interviews. Once in a while they'd be in a talk show or something, and they'd talk for a minute or two, but you never really heard him on TV going in depth about himself or even his music much. At least I haven't seen much. Did you find anything doing your research? Or?
Yeah, he has spoken at some length about things over the years, but it's one of those interesting things where, he'll be talking to somebody about a particular record or what's going on in his life at that moment, and he'll have different reflections on his past as he goes through. He's never really done the kind of consistent, on-point, sort of biographical interviews that a biographer would need to do, which may be one reason why he didn't want to cooperate with me on this book.
Right.
But there are plenty of, there are interviews going back as far as, when he was in high school for the high school newspaper after he and Artie Garfunkel had their first hit in 1957 when they were performing as Tom and Jerry. And even then, he was saying that he was going to retire. That once he and Artie got to college, that these rock and roll days would be behind them for good. So, he says that a lot.
Yeah, you don't get the impression, at least from watching him on TV and stuff, he's kind of an introspective guy, didn't really like, he liked performing, I think, but not really talking about himself much. So that's the impression I get. And even around people he knew well, kind of a low-key guy. Is that the impression you get?
I spoke to one of his best friends from who was in college and, in the late 50s and early 60s, and they were quite close at the time. And I asked this fellow, this was a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, what it was like when Paul, that Paul was both thriving as a student named Paul Simon at Queens College, but in the afternoons he'd get on the subway and go over to Midtown and pursue his career as Jerry Landis, the pop singer, songwriter, producer. And I asked that guy, what was it like? Did you know about Paul's work as Jerry Landis? And he said, Jerry who? I've never heard that word. I've never heard that name before. And he was like silent for a sec when I told him all about it. And it was like, I had no idea. So there is that interesting kind of compartmentalization where, there's a whole community of people who knew him as Jerry Landis and had no idea that he was a college student in Queens. And the other half of his life, people that just knew him as the student and had no idea that he was still working as a pop musician.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's very sort of compartmentalized and sort of unto himself in that way.
I get the impression from knowing a little bit about them, not much obviously, but reading your book, the relationship between he and Art Garfunkel, you could almost parallel a little bit between Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. Great success early, and then they broke up and really never quite got along that well. I know they worked together a few times, but they went on their separate careers, and Paul seemed to have the better career after that, but I guess they both did pretty well, right?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, Artie really had hit after hit in the 70s. I mean, he wasn't as big or as really sort of culturally consuming as Paul was, and he kind of recorded more in a sort of a pop music realm.
Right.
But still, through the late 70s, he was having, he had hits on the charts frequently. And of course was also pursuing an acting career, which was fairly successful at times. So yeah, they both sort of followed their own stars and continue to do the same, though, there have been kind of wonderful moments when they've resumed their partnership, at least as a performing duo, and occasionally recording something together and talking about doing a record. But there's still that dissonance between them that sort of seems to keep them apart.
Yeah. I remember I was in college radio, they did one of their concerts, I guess that was one of them in Central Park. I know they did a couple of them, but that was huge back in the, early 80s, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly right, in the summer of 1981, and it was within a year of when John Lennon had been shot, on the streets of New York City. And I think for, the baby boom generation, which was just then, I think, heading into its mid-late 30s, early 40s, the idea, just sort of the symbolism of Simon and Garfunkel sort of restoring their partnership and their brotherhood and singing those songs just as beautifully as they had ever done was kind of a powerful statement, of, you can go home again, maybe. You can go back to the days of innocence and optimism. Like those things are still out there waiting for us. We hear them now in the voices of Simon and Garfunkel. But, again, that reunion wasn't to last either.
You talk about, again, the different styles Paul Simon had in writing his songs. He had so many hits, but like you said, there were totally different types of songs. You go from The Sound of Silence to a song like 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover. Really totally different types of songs, but he really kind of spread the gamut, didn't he? Yeah,
he really did. And I think, again, that ongoing process of innovation and discovery is, one of the reasons why his career spans, the mid-50s, the height of Elvis, and, all the way to this spring, when the single Wristband from his album Stranger to Stranger came out, and it was being played heavily on college radio,
right.
Alongside artists who were young enough to be his grandchildren.
Yeah, he really is kind of a throwback, and you talk about it in the book, to, I guess, the old Brill Building, right? Isn't that the place where all the songwriters kind of hung out and wrote their music? He kind of bridges the gap between, the 30s and 40s and 50s with those people, and then the current way where you just kind of do it on your own.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a very interesting story in that sense. It's because so much of American history sort of rides through the middle of it. He was involved in various ways in everything from the civil rights movement in the late 50s and early 60s in America up through the start of the hippie era at the Monterey Pop Festival. All the way up through the start of Saturday Night Live, which
right.
he played a role in the mid-'70s, and then, obviously his role in the anti-apartheid movement and causing a lot of static there in the mid-'80s, and just onwards and onwards and onwards till today.
Do you get the impression he's appreciated in the business or among the public as much as he should be? I mean, you look at the body of work, it's amazing what he's turned out.
Well, I think you mentioned the 100 million copies of his records that have sold, so I think that's a form of appreciation.
Sure.
But on the other hand, who knows? He always had this huge rivalry with Bob Dylan, especially in the 60s, when they were young and at the height of their ambition and competitiveness. It always felt like he got the worst of it when people compared him to Dylan and really resented that comparison. And I noticed that when Bob Dylan was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, that the day they announced that was October 13th, which also happened to be Paul Simon's 75th birthday. So sort of an odd coincidence there.
I was going to say, I wonder what he thought of that. I guess he grudgingly would wish him well, but probably inside a little rivalry still, right?
Maybe a little echo of a rivalry,
right.
sort of.
Well, it's a fascinating book, and again, anybody who's a music fan, if you even weren't around that era, I kind of caught the tail end of it. But and again, the movie they did, The Graduate. I mean, not too many rock and roll stars scored movies, so that was a kind of a coup in itself. You talk about that in the book.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was a first too. I mean, and that's of course right, months after the Monterey Pop Festival, or when that movie came out, and it was such an enormously groundbreaking movie, and their music was such a big part of it. But that also held the seeds of their destruction in some way, because Mike Nichols cast both of them in their next movie, his next movie, Catch-22. But then he had to write Paul's part out of the script, and Artie went on to become kind of a movie star for a while, which was part of the conflict that broke up Simon and Garfunkel.
Yeah, Carnal Knowledge, he did too, right? Art Garfunkel, he was in that.
Exactly, he played the lead in Carnal Knowledge, and in
Margaret, not bad.
Exactly, and Jack Nicholson was in there too, so
right.
It was a good.
I only remember Anne Margaret.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
it's a
memory is a selective thing.
That's it. Well, Homeward Bound is the name of the book. I know we just have limited time, but it's about the life of the great Paul Simon, and Peter Ames Carlin has been our guest. And Peter, you have a website you want to direct people to, get more information on the book?
Sure. It is simple, peteramescarlin.com, and there's a blog and all kinds of fun and interesting things there.
Great. Peter, pleasure talking to you. Congratulations on the book, and hopefully we can talk again, but thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm Stan Brock. 30 years ago, I formed Remote Area Medical to help people overseas. But then we found generations of families in America isolated by poverty from the health care they need. Together, we can take dental, vision, and medical help to 1 million adults and their kids, right here at home in the United States of America.
If you'd like to order the book we're talking about, please go to DougMilesMedia.com and enter the author's name in the Amazon search box. Thank you for listening. Please come back soon for more conversations here at DougMilesMedia.com. This has been a presentation of Doug Miles Media, all rights reserved. You can listen to or download previous programs at iTunes, Stitcher.com, or DougMiles.